Everyone, I just wanted to start with a bit of an introduction. I'm Michelle Fanuff with Workplace Fairness West, and my colleague Gary Armstrong are here today to just talk quickly about direct communication or assertive communication. So really looking at what's preventing us from being direct in our communication and what are some tools that we could use to be more successful in that. So do you want to add a bit of an intro, Gary, yourself?
Sure. I'm Gary Armstrong. I'm Michelle's colleague. We've been working together for a couple of years now in workplace fairness, and we've done some mediations together as well through the Alberta Provincial Court System. So we have a little bit of a history of working alongside each other, and we have from time to time engaged in some direct communication with each other.
All with good results.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, that's been my experience. When I put these tools to practice, I have greater success. And they are tools, and they do require practice. It's a different way from how people typically speak.
Yeah, for many people. So let's start there. I'm just going to share my screen, Gary, and look at, maybe start with a question around, what stops us from expressing what we're thinking and being direct? What have you noticed in that?
Well, I can probably speak best for myself. What stops me from being assertive most often is the situation. And so if I'm in a situation where there's a power differential, if I'm speaking to my boss, for example, I'm going to be a little bit more cautious in the language that I choose. And if it's something that I find myself emotional about, I might just back away from it entirely and not have that conversation. If I was to summarize it, what stops me from expressing what I'm thinking, it's quite simply fear. I'm afraid of the results that might take place. And so if I come on too strong, I might be seen as aggressive. And if I don't come on strong enough and I sound apologetic, then I might seem to be passive. And that's not where I want to be. I want people to understand that I have a place, I have thoughts, I have feelings, and I have the place to express those. I'm not looking for everybody to agree with me, but I am looking for people to accept that just as they have a position, I have a position too.
Yeah, and that, I hear from people, they're often afraid it's going to make matters worse. Right?
Yeah,
and fear of stepping into that because you're not sure about the outcome of that.
Yeah, and so we end up in what gets called the double bind situation, and I hear people say, "Well, I have no choice," and it's not so much that I have no choice; it's that I don't like the consequence of the choices that I see. And so if I come across as aggressive, I don't like the consequence of that. If I come across as passive, I don't like the consequence of that. The right note and be assertive is a practiced skill.
Yeah, it does take practice for sure. And I think what I want to add in this piece of the conversation too, Gary, is that also, the way we're brought up or our culture, our family background in how we address these situations within our own family and what we're comfortable with, right? Mm-hmm. Some families are very direct and that's been their natural inclination from a young age. So, in some people, not so much, right? There was some repercussions if you did say what you needed to say, or you grew up with this children should be seen but not heard, or some of those cultural impacts that we have, cultural being our family, right? And
well, yes, well, and cultural too in today's world being international.
Yeah.
Right, and so your point is well taken. There, different cultures express themselves in different ways, and the fact that I am from a specific culture where there's perhaps more of a direct way of communicating and even in some cultures to my Canadian ear, um, they sound almost aggressive. And yet within that culture, that's totally acceptable. That's the way that people speak. And I don't bring Canadian up lightly. Uh, we're, we are seen, Canadians typically are seen as apologetic on the world stage. Uh, and so if I'm having a conversation with somebody from South America or from the United States or from China, there's going to be a different perception of me just because of where I'm from, and the same for them. And I think the challenge is for us to always remember that people are just being the way they were brought up, and it's not intended to be aggressive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's look a bit more at those different types of behaviors. But before we do that, I just want to touch on this, why be assertive? Why be direct? I really like these two circles that are intersecting to look at being able to meet both people's needs in this situation or conversation, right? That it's not just about meeting your needs that may come across more on the aggressive side, and it's not always about meeting other people's needs, because that's tied into that passive behavior. But it's the opportunity to do both of those, right?
Yeah, right. And in that opportunity, that's where we end up talking about those win-win agreements, those negotiations where both sides are able to say, this is what I want, this is what I need, and then negotiate towards what the step forward is.
Yeah, I think if you're coming from that mindset of negotiation and being able to meet both parties' needs, that's where you want to be in that directive piece. I'm going to skip through some of this. Maybe let's look at these different types of behaviors or communication styles. And again, I don't want to, put labels on people. It's more the behaviors that we're looking at.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
And
maybe start with this, Gary, and kind of what this says to you.
well, it's interesting. I had a conversation this morning with a client, and it was all about behaviors and intent. And so often people will say, the way that you talked to me was insulting. And their reply will be, well, that wasn't my intention. And there's not many people that step out in the world and say, today I'm going to go make someone's life miserable. I'll acknowledge that there's maybe a few, but it's not generally within what people are looking to do. And so when I behave in whatever way, my behavior gets judged. And people put it through their own, well, we talked a moment ago, through their own cultural and life experiences. And you may behave with me in a way that is totally acceptable and go and behave the same way down the hall with somebody else, and they're feeling insulted by it or hurt by it. And so it then becomes, what was my behavior that caused people to form that opinion? And for the
and the opportunity for the other person to step into that conversation to indicate how they're feeling by being impacted, or how they're being impacted, I guess, by those behaviors.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's as wide and as diverse as there are people.
Yeah, for sure.
The things that offend you may not offend me. The things that upset me may not upset you. And it's not a question of right or wrong, and it's not a question of whether or not I meant it. It's more a matter of, do I want to be seen as a respectful person within the workplace? And if I'm going to be seen as a respectful person, then I need to behave in a respectful way. And a respectful way to not be seen as aggressive is that I do not boldly insist that my rights and needs prevail. Mm-hmm. And if I want to be seen as if I don't want to be seen as passive, rather, then I need to recognize that my rights also have a place and that we are on equals. And if I don't want to be seen as passive or aggressive, I need to make sure that I stand for my rights, which in this case puts us in the top right quadrant. And assertive behavior is that I clearly express that we both have rights. You want X, I want Y. And from our work in mediations, I used to tell people we're here to get a win-win. But I want you to know that it's going to feel like a lose-lose. Because if I was going to get what I wanted, we wouldn't be in conflict. If I wasn't hurt by the situation, we wouldn't be in conflict. And so I need for my own well-being to stand up for my rights and for my needs in a respectful way.
Yeah, and I know we talk a lot about having our own interests met. So, to be able to step away from, your position or what you want versus what's my interest under here, which we often refer to as a value or a need. But what I did want to point out too in this slide was that the scale, right? The high openness of communication versus high consideration for others. And that's where that assertive behavior lies. So really, and I have some resources at the end that I want to share, but there's a lot of kindness related to assertive behavior, right? You want to be in the mindset where you're coming at this.
Well, yeah.
A kind thing and a considerate thing to be doing.
Right. And there is kindness in it, both for the other and for me.
Mm-hmm.
There's a tool that gets used to assess people's preference around assertiveness, and it's the Thomas Kilmann tool is the name of it, and it's to just measure conflict styles. And if you could go back to the last slide just for a second, in that, I would be what is known, I come out as what's known as an avoider. And so consideration for others and openness to communication, I would actually sit in the bottom left quadrant. Somebody asked, well, how can you be that? Like, what is an avoider? And I said, well, an avoider is not open for communication and they're very inconsiderate of others. And I'll show you what that means. And then I walked away. I'm not even there for the conversation, which is not being very considerate of others, and it's certainly not being open in my communication.
Yeah, so let's talk a bit more about those different types of behavior. So, you were kind of talking about the passive piece of, possibly removing yourself from the conversation, not entering into the conversation. What about passive aggressive?
Yeah, well, for me, passive aggressive is a toxic behavior, and it's easily for me. It's easiest to explain as me not having the courage to step up and be assertive, and so me acting a little bit passive at the same time.
And what I often see in that, Gary, is people not being able to express what they're thinking in the moment or, in a meeting or face to face, but then kind of going away and expressing to others.
Yeah, absolutely. So it comes out as gossip, or it comes out, I've seen it come out as what people would call practical jokes. Right? I didn't have the courage to say what I needed to at the meeting. I want to let Gary know that I'm upset with him, so I'm going to hide his stapler on. Mm-hmm. Right?
Or those kind of behind the cuff comments, right? Like off the cuff comments about, oh yeah, did you see what Gary did? Or right, kind of those little remarks on the side, I guess.
Yeah, and all of that is toxic behavior, and I now explain it is it's just simply me or the other lacking the courage to go to the individual directly, right? And so if I have an issue with you, if there's something that was said at a meeting that I'm upset about, excuse me, I have a responsibility to myself to not avoid it and to come to you directly and say, Michelle, this is what happened at the meeting. I felt a little bit demeaned by it, or I felt dismissed when I was making my comment. And I'd really like to see our relationship change so that that doesn't happen again. You know,
Yeah, and what about on that aggressive side, Gary? What sorts of behaviors would you point out to just help people understand what that might look like?
sure. Well, if we were to call it on the aggressive side, just simply including the word you into that same scenario. Michelle, you at that meeting, when you said this, you were insulting and you made me mad. Right? All of that now is blaming you for how I feel. And truth be known, you can't make me feel anything. But this is one of the things that I believe I was brought up to pass on to other people. It's somebody else's fault. If I'm sad, it must be somebody else's fault. And yet when I'm happy, well, that's got everything to do with me. Right? And
Yeah.
it can't be both ways. And so
So kind of that blaming language. I've also seen, some, and relating back maybe to that, having your own needs met, right? Like being too forward around not including others or thinking about how we can meet others' needs, that we're just so focused on our own needs and pushing through agendas. And some of the behaviors that come along with that are speaking loud or speaking over people, interrupting people. Being overly focused on your own goal.
Yeah. And I have a play that I work back and forth in my head, and there's this little bit about empathy that enters into it as well. And I can bring emotions down by showing the other person that I've heard what they've had to say, and that I'm putting the extra effort into it to identify how they're feeling at that moment.
Yeah.
And so the aggressive behavior, it can come out in language, in my opinion. It comes out in the words that we choose, and then it comes out in nonverbal behaviors, leaning forward, standing up, pounding fists, slamming doors, raising voices, all of those things. And they're typically a reflection of how somebody's feeling at the moment. And when somebody's behaving in that way, if I simply say to them, this is frustrating for you, I'll notice people will temper their emotions by a notch or two. They just it de-escalates.
Yeah, for sure. Acknowledging emotions, acknowledging what's going on in the room. Yeah. So I just want to go to quickly our tool that we wanted to share today, Gary, and this comes from Marshall Rosenberg, his work with nonviolent communication, which has had an impact across the world. And so just to recognize it is a tool, it's a methodology, use what you can from it. Quickly, I just want to say, it's about using the opportunity to be able to use that I language, right? To kind of keep it to yourself so we don't sound like we're blaming others. So I notice, reveal specific details that describe the situation. Sally, I noticed that in our meeting today, you've only spoken, twice. That's just an observation, right? It's not a judgment. It's not any assumptions tied to that. It's just very specific to what you're seeing, and share how you're feeling. Right? I'm worried about that. So,
right.
So acknowledge that and say what you need. What is it that's concerning you? I really need to ensure that everyone in the group has an opportunity to have their voice heard in these discussions that we have. right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And a request, add a request to that. I really hope, Sally, that in the future you're able to join into our conversation
Right.
in a bigger way, right?
Yeah. The one I need, that one goes both ways too. I have a story where I was sitting in a restaurant and I was unhappy with the service that I received, and I brought it to the waitress's attention, and then she said, "Oh, okay. Well, what do you need right now?" And I was dumbfounded. I was lost. I hadn't thought that far ahead. All I was thinking was that I was angry. And just by asking and showing that empathy again to the other side in the middle of it all, and kudos to her, because when somebody is complaining, most people's reaction is to be defensive,
Mm-hmm.
right? And she opened up the door and said, well, what can we do to make this better? And if
Yeah,
everything,
and I think that's an important piece of this model, is that need is to be able to encompass both your needs in that conversation, right? Because that the sort of behavior we're trying to meet both people's needs. So often when we talk about needs, our own need and right the other person's need in with that.
right?
But I also want to say that, you know, this is an opportunity to practice or experiment with this model, and that if you don't have that, it's hard to use it in the situation you want to use it in. If you don't feel comfortable using it, you're not going to be able to use it in a higher stakes conversation. So really to get out there and practice with this and experiment with it, what works good for you, what doesn't, what lands better, what feels better for you, what's more comfortable. Just get out there and really start
Yeah,
practicing with it.
yeah, absolutely. I encourage people to find somebody to practice with.
Yeah.
I also tell them you only get to practice with one person, because if you practice with five, now you're gossiping.
If you're talking about your specific situation, yeah, that
Right.
you're struggling with.
Yeah. So, yeah, find somebody to practice with. Watch for the use of the word you. Make sure that I is being used appropriately, and make sure that feelings are being expressed. It's the feeling word, surprisingly. People say there's take the emotions out of negotiations and take the emotions out of business. And surprisingly, we make our decisions based on emotion. We are influenced by emotion.
Yeah,
And
we're not robots, especially in the workplace, right? We come with
exactly,
our own feelings and emotions, and we need to be able to acknowledge that.
yeah. And I think it's more, the language I use now is it's more about managing the emotions. Don't take them out.
Mm,
Acknowledge and manage them,
yeah.
right?
Don't take them out on others. Yeah.
Well, yeah, don't take them out on others too, for sure.
Yeah. So this last little wrap up piece, I just wanted to share some resources for people. Workplace communications, being direct is kind, and also about, as an introvert, right? That might be more difficult for us to be assertive. So some
Mhm.
kind of 3 steps for that. The Marshall Rosenberg's book, Nonviolent Communication,
Right.
and there's also a TED Talk, Adam Galinsky, I wanted to share, so people can dig into those in the time they have. But yeah, I want to thank everyone for joining us for this quick little chat, and we'll have more and others coming up on the web. And thanks from Workplace Fairness West for joining us.
Thank you, Michelle.
Okay, take care.